Have you ever felt her disappear right after you finally let her in? You didn't cry, you didn't fall apart, you just opened up, you told the truth. And somehow, that was the moment everything changed. The replies got shorter, the warmth faded, and within days, she was gone. You replayed it over and over, thinking maybe you were too much, too fast, too emotional. But what if it wasn't the content, but the context? What if your vulnerability wasn't received as closeness, but as weight? Freud understood the silent transaction behind every moment like this. He knew why intimacy often triggers retreat, and why men, especially men, mistake emotional truth for emotional safety. Stay with this, because in the end, we'll reveal the deeper signal your honesty sent her. There's a specific kind of silence that only comes after intimacy. It doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like disappearance. You didn't confess anything dramatic. You didn't beg. You didn't break down. You simply said something honest, something that mattered. And within hours or days, the tone shifted. The ease that used to be there, the little jokes, the instinctive warmth, started to evaporate. Not in a dramatic way, but gradually, unmistakably, like a door closing 1 inch at a time. Most men don't notice it at first. They assume she's tired, distracted. They wait a few days, give her space, try again. But deep down, they already know something broke. And the worst part is that it broke in the exact moment they thought connection was forming. This is the shock. Not just that she pulled away, but when she pulled away, right after you got real. For men, that moment hits with particular violence, because we're not taught to share by default. We're taught to hold everything in, to wait until it's earned, to only open up when there's trust, when there's safety, when it means something. So when a man finally chooses to speak from the inside, it's never casual. It's a quiet risk that carries enormous weight. That's why her silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like punishment. And that punishment strikes at the root of something unspoken. The belief that if I'm finally real, she'll finally stay. That's the myth most men carry into adulthood. Not that being emotional will make you weak, but that being authentic will make you lovable. And when that belief shatters, it doesn't just hurt, it rearranges everything. Because now the math doesn't work. If vulnerability leads to distance and honesty leads to loss, what's left? What are you supposed to build trust with? What do you give her if even the truth makes her leave? Some men double down. They get colder, quieter, harder. They become masters of control. They never let anyone close again. Others collapse inward. They over-explain, apologize, try to undo the damage. Both are reactions to the same wound. I showed her who I was, and she disappeared. But the most important thing to understand is this. Her reaction wasn't logical. It wasn't about your tone, your wording, or your level of emotion. It wasn't about a mistake. It was about something deeper, something older. You didn't trigger her fear of you. You triggered her fear of herself. And Freud, more than anyone, spent his life trying to name that fear, not to blame her, not to shame men, but to finally understand what happens in those moments when truth becomes too much. That's where we go next. Because her silence isn't random. It's a response to a signal she couldn't name, but her unconscious recognized instantly. We like to think communication happens on the surface. You say something, she hears it, she responds. But Freud never believed in that kind of neat exchange. He argued that every word, every gesture, every pause carries something underneath it, something unspoken, something unconscious. So when you opened up, when you shared that private thought, that quiet fear, that buried memory, you didn't just offer information, you sent a signal. And it wasn't a weak signal either. It wasn't, I'm broken. It was, here I am, I trust you with this. And that signal, according to Freud, strikes somewhere much deeper than logic. Because in her world, consciously or not, vulnerability often doesn't read as connection. It reads as weight. Not because she's selfish, not because she lacks empathy, but because the unconscious hears things the mind doesn't. When a man reveals himself, it awakens something she can't always name. The fear of responsibility, the fear of emotional debt, the fear of having to hold something fragile she never asked for. Freud called this transference, the tendency to project old emotional patterns onto present relationships. And what happens, often without either of you realizing it, is this. She hears your honesty not as presence, but as pressure. She doesn't think it, she feels it. And the feeling tells her to pull back, because suddenly she's no longer just herself. She's your witness, your mirror, your emotional container, and unless she's prepared to hold that role, she retreats. That retreat isn't about your story. It's about the unconscious responsibility you passed to her the moment you spoke it aloud. Freud's insight here is brutal. Even when we speak clearly, we're still misunderstood because people don't hear what we mean. They hear what it activates in them. And if that activation touches her old fears of being needed, being consumed, being trapped, she pulls away, not from your truth, but from her own reaction to it. If you've ever felt that sudden shift, where one moment you're safe and the next you're radioactive, if you've ever shared something raw and watched someone emotionally vanish, that feeling stays with you. It makes you second-guess everything you give. If you've felt that, if your honesty has ever been met with silence, hit like and subscribe, not for validation, but so this story doesn't just live in your head anymore. You're not the only one who's been through it. To you, it felt like a gift. You offered something personal, something rarely shown, not as a test, not as a trap, just as a moment of truth. But what most men forget is this: openness isn't always received as intimacy. Sometimes it's felt as obligation. You didn't say, "Fix me," but her body heard it. You didn't say, "Stay," but her unconscious translated it that way. Because emotional exposure doesn't just carry meaning, it carries implication. Freud believed that behind every interaction is a web of unconscious roles. The moment you become vulnerable, you're no longer just a man. You become a boy needing a mother, a patient needing a therapist, a soul asking to be held. And even if you never meant it that way, the effect is the same. She feels like she's being asked for something, not directly, not verbally, but emotionally. And here's where it gets heavier. If she isn't grounded in her own emotional capacity, if she hasn't worked through her own need to be wanted but not needed, if she still fears being consumed by someone else's pain, then what you shared doesn't land as closeness. It lands as pressure. It doesn't matter how calmly you said it. It doesn't matter if you framed it perfectly. The weight was there. And for someone who wasn't ready to carry it, pulling away felt like survival. This is the part most men never see, because they think, "But I didn't ask for anything." And they're right, on the surface. But the unconscious doesn't work with words. It works with symbols, tone, timing, energy. You may have spent years holding everything in. You may have waited until you were sure. And in that one vulnerable moment, you felt a quiet hope. Maybe she's the one who can handle it. And that hope, that silent expectation, is what she felt. Not through logic, but through presence. So when she pulled back, it wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about punishment. It was about the emotional tax she suddenly sensed. One she never agreed to pay. That's the tragedy here. The moment that meant everything to you might have landed as a threat to her autonomy, not because you said too much, but because your truth carried the invisible cost of being felt. And for someone unprepared, feeling you is heavier than hearing you. It's not fair, it's not even rational, but it's real. And until that reality is seen, Most men will keep handing their hearts to people who don't have arms strong enough to hold them. That's where Freud takes us next, into the mirror, because the person who recoils from your vulnerability isn't always recoiling from you. When Freud studied early development, he described something called the mirror phase. That pivotal moment when a child first recognizes their reflection and begins to form an image of self. It's a strange kind of awakening. Not pure self-awareness, but self as object, something seen, judged, and eventually performed. Most men assume this moment is long behind them, but it gets repeated every time you enter into intimacy. Because the moment someone truly sees you, you're no longer invisible, you're defined. This is what Freud understood about relationships that most people still don't. Intimacy doesn't just reveal you to her, it reveals her to herself. And sometimes that reflection is more than she's ready for. When you opened up, you may have triggered not just her sympathy, but her self-surveillance, her inner critic, her old wounds. You weren't just a man with a story, you were a mirror held up without permission. And in that reflection, she may have seen her own emotional limitations, her fear of not being enough, her discomfort with real connection, or worse, her own pattern of detachment when things get close. That's what makes your vulnerability so dangerous. Not because of what it reveals about you, but because of what it accidentally exposes in someone else. This is the reversal. You didn't lose her because you were weak. You lost her because your honesty unmasked her. That moment you hoped would bring closeness may have thrown her into confrontation with parts of herself she's spent years avoiding. And in that confrontation, she didn't just step back from you, she stepped back from the version of herself that couldn't hold you. That kind of retreat feels deeply personal, but it isn't always. Sometimes you were just the trigger, not the cause. So if you've ever opened up only to feel like you suddenly became too much, if you've ever watched someone withdraw after you finally stopped pretending, that wasn't about failure, it was about reflection. If that moment ever happened to you, when your truth made someone see what they weren't ready to, drop a comment. You don't need to explain everything. Just write, "I've been the mirror," because chances are you're not the only one. From the time we're boys, we're taught that trust is earned, not given. That emotion is a resource, not a default setting. So most men don't grow up oversharing. They grow up withholding. They become masters of containment. Pain gets tucked beneath performance. Fear hides behind competence. The smile becomes armor, but somewhere along the way, a quiet belief forms beneath all of that. One day when it's safe, I'll finally show someone who I really am. Not for pity, not for relief, but for recognition. And so when it finally happens, when the words come out, when the guard drops, when something true slips through, there's this hope, often unspoken. Now she'll understand me. Now we'll be close. That hope is honest, but it's also dangerous because it assumes that vulnerability leads to bonding, that honesty creates safety, that truth is a kind of emotional currency, and if you spend it wisely, it buys closeness. But relationships don't run on currency. They run on capacity. And if the person you're opening up to doesn't have the capacity to receive what you're offering, then no amount of truth will bridge the gap. In fact, the more honest you are, the more threatened they'll feel. Freud saw this in patient after patient, especially in men, those who believed that emotional exposure was a transaction, that if I open up, I'll get something back. But the unconscious doesn't play by those rules. This is where most men miscalculate. They wait until they're sure, until the timing feels right, until they trust her enough to share what they've kept hidden. And then, once they do, they expect something back, a gesture, reassurance, some signal that says, "You're safe here." But instead, they often receive withdrawal, emotional absence, distance that feels like rejection. Not because they did something wrong, but because they expected intimacy to follow logic. It doesn't. This isn't about blaming men for hoping. It's about recognizing where the hope was planted. Most of us learned that emotional truth is rare and therefore precious. But precious to whom? Not everyone wants to hold what's real. Not everyone is built for weight. And when you treat vulnerability like a milestone, you risk placing your identity in someone else's hands. Freud's work reminds us, we don't just suffer from rejection, we suffer from misreading the game. Because when we believe truth should be rewarded, we collapse the difference between honesty and intimacy. And that collapse hurts worse than silence. In the final section, we'll uncover what your vulnerability actually signals, not to her conscious mind, but to the unconscious forces that shaped her before she ever met you. At the center of this entire pattern is a word no one wants to admit: need. Not because it's shameful, but because it terrifies both sides in different ways. When you opened up, you may not have asked for anything. You didn't beg, you didn't demand, but the subtext was there. I trust you with this. I want you to stay after seeing this. And no matter how careful you were, no matter how composed, your vulnerability carried a signal that went deeper than intention. It said, I need you to hold this with me. Freud's brilliance was in seeing the power of unspoken emotional contracts, and he believed we're never just sharing stories, we're transferring psychic energy. Invisible, involuntary, and deeply felt. So what happens when that energy lands in someone who's not ready, who never signed up to be seen as a container, who wants closeness but without responsibility? They panic, not on the surface, not in words, but in the body, in the nervous system, in the place where memory lives without language. And that panic says, if I stay, I might disappear inside this. If I stay, I might not be enough. So she retreats, not because you were broken, but because your presence demanded weight she couldn't hold. That's what makes this pain so hard to process. Because it feels like rejection, but it isn't about you. It's about the role you unconsciously asked her to play. The stable one, the strong one, the witness. Freud might argue it wasn't your emotion that pushed her away. It was your need, the one you didn't say aloud but couldn't fully hide. And in her, that need activated something primal. A fear of being responsible for someone else's inner world. A fear of becoming the parent. A fear of being needed in a way that consumes autonomy. This is the part no one tells men. She may love your personality, she may be drawn to your story, but if she senses that you need her to feel whole, she will leave. Not because you're weak, but because her unconscious remembers what it's like to lose herself in someone else's pain. This isn't about erasing vulnerability. It's about holding it without asking others to stabilize it, to speak your truth without needing them to carry it. That's what separates emotional depth from emotional weight. So if you've ever felt the sting of someone stepping away after your most honest moment, if you've ever watched closeness collapse the moment you got real, understand this. It wasn't the truth that scared her. It was what the truth required. And the part that hurts most is this. You weren't asking for much, just for someone to stay. You came here with a question. Why did she pull away the moment you opened up? Now you know it wasn't weakness. It wasn't the story you told. It wasn't even her judgment of you. It was the weight your truth carried, the unconscious signal that said, see me and stay. And for someone who wasn't ready to hold that, retreat became the only option. What Freud revealed, and what most men never realize, is this. Vulnerability is not a transaction. It doesn't guarantee closeness. It only reveals capacity, and not everyone has the strength to witness you and remain whole. So if she pulled away, it doesn't mean you were too much. It might mean she was never prepared to see you without seeing herself. That's the deeper truth. And it's one most people aren't ready to say out loud. But now that you've seen it, what kind of man do you become when you no longer need to be understood to be whole?